Many of the major Western traditions have an answer for what happens after suicide. Most involve punishment, eternal fire, or a soul trapped in permanent unrest. And then there is what Seth says, which is neither of those things. No punishment is meted out. The soul is treated exactly as anyone else who has crossed that threshold. But, and this is where it gets precise, any problem that was not faced here will have to be faced somewhere else. Not as divine retribution, but as the simple mechanics of how consciousness works. Understanding this distinction is crucial. If Seth is right, the framework most of us inherited is built on a fundamental misunderstanding. One that doesn't just distort what we expect after death. It quietly misdirects how we handle unresolved problems right now in this life. That is what we are going to explore here. Suicide is one of those topics most frameworks struggle to address on its own terms. Religion tends toward judgment, which layers guilt and terror onto grief. Modern secular thinking often swings the other way. It says nothing about what comes after because it assumes nothing does. Both of those positions avoid the harder question. Not, is there punishment? But what is actually happening to that consciousness, and where does it go from there? Seth addresses this directly, and the picture he offers requires you to set aside both the fear of divine retribution and the assumption that the act carries no real consequences. Both are shortcuts. What he offers instead is a description, precise, structural, and entirely consistent with how he describes consciousness operating in every other context. If you have been following this series, you already know the foundation. Consciousness does not stop at death. The question is never whether it continues. The question is always how and under what conditions. That is what makes this particular case worth examining on its own terms. There is one thing that makes all of this work. Consciousness, in Seth's framework, creates its own experience, before death, during physical life, and after. This is the structural principle that underlies everything else. And when you apply it to this question, the answer becomes specific. Seth states this plainly: suicides, as a class, do not have any particular special judgment meted out to them. Their condition is not worse, as a starting point, than anyone else who has crossed that threshold. They are treated as individuals. There is no special category of damnation waiting. No cosmic tribunal. No verdict. Many religious traditions taught otherwise, that an act of self-destruction carries a moral weight that triggers a specific divine response. Seth is direct. That is not what happens. The architecture of consciousness after death does not include an external judge reviewing the circumstances and issuing a sentence. What it does include is the continuation of what the consciousness was already doing, working through the patterns and problems that belong to it. And that is where the precision comes in. Any problems that were not faced in this life will be faced in another. Not as a condition imposed from outside, but as the natural continuation of what the consciousness was moving through. The work does not disappear because the physical framework did. Think of it this way. A student who leaves school mid-year does not lose the curriculum. The material does not vanish. But more than that, the student genuinely needs that material, not because someone decided they should have it, but because the understanding it builds is something the consciousness itself is moving toward. It is not an obligation from outside. It is the next step in a process the soul itself chose to be in. When that student returns to a classroom, they begin from where they left off, because the learning belongs to them, and they belong to it. Here the idea opens up. The conditions surrounding the act are also important. The inner reality of the individual at the moment of transition matters greatly. Many traditions have taught that suicide is met by some special, almost vindictive fate. That is not the case. But what is the case is this. If a person ends their life while believing that the act will annihilate their consciousness forever, If that belief is what they carry into the transition, then that false idea will shape what they immediately will encounter. Consciousness creates experience according to what it holds. A conviction of annihilation, held strongly, generates a kind of experiential confusion. The individual, not realizing they are still conscious and aware, cannot orient toward what is actually happening around them. Seth describes what follows. Teachers, his term, are available, specifically to reach this person and help them understand where they are. If you watched the previous video, you already know something about how that works. How newly arrived consciousnesses are met and oriented. What is specific to this case is that the disorientation can be deeper, because the belief that produced it was more total. The work of those teachers in this situation is to help the individual recognize that what they are experiencing is not the end, and never was. In some cases, something further is done. An amnesia effect is induced. The event of the suicide is temporarily set aside, and the individual is led back, in terms of inner experience, to the situation that preceded the decision, not to relive it under pressure, but to examine it more clearly, from a position of greater calm. Only when the person is genuinely ready to face it is the memory returned. The goal of all of this is orientation. The consciousness needs to understand what happened and why, not as a verdict, but as a clear picture. And that picture becomes available, fully, in the period of self-examination that follows every transition. Because what Seth describes here is not passive. The state after death is not a holding room. It is an active process. The same capacities that were operating in physical life. The ability to understand, to reassess, to choose, continue operating. And through that process, something specific happens. The consciousness identifies what remains unresolved. The patterns that were present but not worked through. The problems that the life contained but did not complete. And those become the material for what comes next. After the period of evaluation and reorientation, the consciousness begins the same process that any personality goes through between lives. The problems that remained, the ones that may have contributed to the decision itself or that were simply unfinished, become part of the structure of the next physical existence, not built in as suffering. Incorporated as learning material that the entity itself chooses, because the entity is oriented toward its own development and toward the fullest expression of what it contains. So the phrase, "the problems will be faced in another life," means this, precisely. The entity does not abandon what that personality carried. It works with it. It takes it forward. The material becomes part of the design of what comes next. Psychology has observed from a very different direction something that points toward the same structure. Unresolved psychological material does not stay inert. It resurfaces, in patterns, in recurring situations, in the shape of what keeps showing up in a life. The inner self appears oriented toward resolution. It finds ways to return to what was not finished. Seth's account takes that observation and extends it far beyond what psychology can reach. What psychology sees as the unconscious tending toward resolution within one life, Seth describes as a fundamental characteristic of consciousness itself, operating across the full arc of what the entity is doing, across multiple lives, across the entire span of the reincarnational process. The planning that takes place between lives is deliberate. The specific problems, the specific patterns, the specific unresolved material, these are what the entity identifies and builds into the next framework. The circumstances chosen, the kinds of challenges built into the new existence, selected with the unfinished learning in view. What that planning actually looks like, and everything that happens in the space between lives, is something we will go into fully in a later video, because it deserves that depth. This is a system that has no interest in judgment and no mechanism for it, but which is entirely oriented toward development. The entity is not looking for a place to assign blame. It is looking for the next opportunity to bring forward what it carries. For anyone who has lost someone to suicide, this matters. The person was not condemned. The person was not frozen at the moment of the act. The same consciousness that was moving through its life is continuing to move, through a different kind of process, toward the same broad destination that all consciousness is moving toward. The structural observation Seth makes is that the thing a consciousness was trying to escape does not disappear when the physical life ends. It travels with the consciousness because it belongs to it, not as a burden imposed from outside, as part of the unfinished arc of what that consciousness is working toward, and that work remains possible. The capacity for it does not close. There is a question worth sitting with after this. If the consciousness carries its unresolved material forward, not as a consequence handed down, but as the natural continuation of its own developmental arc, then the question for any life, including this one, is not, have I suffered enough? The question is, what is the consciousness here to work through? And is it actually being approached? Seth's framework suggests that the pull toward resolution is built into consciousness itself. It does not require forcing, but it does require honesty about what is actually there. That is what this leaves you with. If something in this raised a question about what continuation looks like, about the planning between lives, about how this connects to something you have been sitting with, leave it in the comments. These are the questions that open the next layer, and they help shape where this series goes from here. The picture Seth draws is one in which no consciousness is abandoned, and no act places the soul outside the reach of its own ongoing development. That raises an immediate question, not abstract, but physical. If the consciousness carries its patterns forward even through the full dissolution of the body, what happens when those same patterns are running inside the body, right now, in opposite directions at the same time? What happens when one part of you wants something genuinely, and another part of you holds an equally genuine belief that the opposite is true? And both of those are sending instructions to the same physical system simultaneously. The body does not follow what you say you want. It follows the dominant belief. And when two beliefs are equally strong, but point in opposite directions, the body produces a pattern that tries to serve both at once. From the outside, that looks like weakness, contradiction, self-sabotage. From the inside, from the level Seth is describing, it is the body working exactly as it should. That mechanism and what it means for everything from physical health to the patterns you cannot seem to break is what the next video examines.